Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Governor Kitzhaber. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. As a child of the 60s, I was overwhelmed by Rodney Hicks' song. Let's give him another hand. Let's see if I can get him to go up and sing that in Olympia. I want to thank Derek and these other individuals who told such powerful stories today, and the education budget that I have presented seeks to ensure that stories like these are the rule rather than the exception around Oregon. Investment in education is the centerpiece of my general fund budget, consuming about 50% of the general fund, a total investment of $9.4 billion. And since time is limited here this morning, I want to focus just on two practical elements of this budget that were reflected in the stories we heard today. The first is early learning, and the second one is connecting education to careers. Before I do, I want to make three general observations that hopefully will set the tone for the legislative session. The first is the fact that notwithstanding that this budget is $800,000 larger than last year's budget and $2 billion larger than the budget in 2011 and 13, its release was met by cries of dismay from most of the educational advocates who believed that they didn't get enough money. Now, that didn't come as a total surprise to me, and to some extent it is true. But before these advocates begin to seek to get more money into their particular silo, I think there are a couple things we need to keep in mind. The first one is that every zero-sum budget involves trade-offs. So we had to make a macro allocation for how much we put in education versus other parts of the budget, and then we had to decide how to spend those dollars that we left in education. And secondly, the money has to come from somewhere. So pulling dollars out of other parts of the budget to put in education can, in some cases, jeopardize the ability of children to actually learn. So, for example, I read an article recently that pointed out that the number of homeless school children in the Beaverton School District has gone from 695 last year to 841 this year. So the point is, the money we're spending on housing, the money we're spending on mental health, the money we're spending on stabilizing families has a huge impact on the ability of these young kids to succeed. And finally, if the legislative debate is driven entirely by trying to maximize money in these individual silos, we will not only undermine our 40-40-20 objectives, but also a lot of the hard work that we've done over the past 4 years, which is built on the recognition that education doesn't take place in silos, it takes place in a continuum from early learning to post-secondary education, and the system is only as strong as its weakest link. My second observation has to do with outcomes. And, the understandable effort to get more money into one or another educational silo does not necessarily translate into better outcomes for children. What it says, at least on the surface, is we need more money to do what we did last biennium. And I don't think that's good enough anymore. It seems to me that to reach our 40-40-20 objectives, we're going to have to be more strategic in how we spend those dollars, particularly around initiatives that have demonstrated the ability to move students through those difficult transitions from early learning to kindergarten and third grade, being on track to graduate in ninth grade, which is directly related to the number of high school credits they earn when they come into ninth grade, and of course the important transition from high school to post-secondary education. So therefore, along with increasing the dollars in the state school fund and the public university and community college support fund, I've also proposed some changes in the current funding formulas within those funds to reward outcomes rather than simply enrollment. And that's part of a larger effort to try to change the state's role in education finance from a passive funder of institutions and enrollment to an active investor in the outcomes of students as they move across the continuum. Now, I've proposed three specific changes in the state school fund, for example. One creates an incentive for schools to actually ensure that students who are in an English language program succeed in getting out of that program. The second is an incentive to add career and technical education. And the third creates an incentive to ensure that ninth graders are on track to graduate. Now, historically, and this year isn't an exception, when you propose changes to funding formulas, you meet with a significant amount of opposition because people are concerned that there'll be winners and losers because essentially you're reallocating dollars within the same fund. But I think it's important to define what we mean by winners and losers, because all too often winners and losers refer to school districts but not necessarily to children. And let me give you a perspective. If you look at within that population of students that can benefit from an English language learning program, a school will be a loser if they fail to ensure that that student doesn't successfully get out of the program, but the student will actually be a winner, because research shows that kids who get out of an ELL program are much more likely to graduate, and indeed more likely to graduate even than their fellow students for whom English is a first language. So to me, that just makes eminent sense. And it's also important to recognize that all three of these formula changes constitute 1.7%. 1.7% of the overall state school fund. So I think if we're willing to continue to put our children's potential at the center of our focus, that we can successfully begin to shift the system incentives to achieve our 40-40-20 objectives. As you know, the English language learning population is one in which we're going to have to disproportionately move the dial if we're going to achieve 40-40-20. It represents one of the fastest growing segments in our population in Oregon. It's a population that lags behind in terms of opportunity and academic achievement. So to me, this is also an issue of equity. It's an issue of the depth of our commitment to ensure that all of our students have an equal opportunity to learn, and a commitment to doing what's necessary to achieve 40-40-20. And my third observation has to do with an emphasis on equity and on collective impact. This budget was put together very intentionally through an equity lens, because it's clear to me that if we want to achieve our educational objectives, but also our commitment to equity and opportunity in this state, that we have to break down the silos and barriers that for too long have been corrosive to the opportunity for children to learn, and that is particularly true of students of color and students who live in poverty. So this is an opportunity for us to walk our talk. Throughout this budget, you're going to see efforts that have specifically been targeted to students in need, but also to build partnerships with institutions and community-based organizations that have a track record of actually building success around these students. Now let me turn briefly to the two pathways I mentioned earlier. The first pathway is the pathway from kindergarten to third grade readiness. This budget invests $440 million to create a clear path from age 3 to grade 3. And this investment is based on the very simple principle that investing at the earliest possible point in a child's education and development gives them by far the greatest chance to succeed, but also saves us huge amounts of money downstream in terms of remediation, in terms of dropout, in terms of avoidable costs in our social service systems and our criminal justice system. In other words, focusing on early learning in childhood development gives us perhaps the biggest return on investment that we can possibly get. The problem is you can't see that return in a 2-year budget cycle, which is why young children often get shortchanged. But unless we can find the discipline to invest on the front end over a sustained period of time, we simply aren't going to achieve our 40-40-20 objectives. So this investment is broken into 3 parts: all-day kindergarten, early learning, and what I call a literacy package. And all 3 are essential, because if all we do is fund all-day kindergarten, but don't link it in a thoughtful way to early learning and preschool, and if we don't link kindergarten with professional development and curricular alignment up through 3rd grade, we've created another place to park your children, but we're not going to achieve the literacy objectives that we're trying to find. So if we can sustain this investment over the next several biennia, we think we can get between 90 and 95% of Oregon school children reading at level in 3rd grade within 5 years. And just think for a minute what that would mean in terms of success, in terms of educational achievement, in terms of eliminating the opportunity gap. But to get there, we've got to meet our benchmarks on kindergarten readiness. We've got to meet our benchmarks on stable, attached families in 3rd grade reading. And finally, I want to touch on the pathway of connecting education to career. And we just heard some eloquent stories about that. Now, in addition to ensuring that our children have a balanced, well-rounded education, we also need to connect them to a career. not only to strengthen the foundation of our economy, but also to reduce poverty and increase opportunity. So I have a very significant commitment to career and technical education in this budget, both the CTA formula change that I mentioned before, but also additional resources for revitalization grants. And there's also an investment of $15 million for STEM strategies and STEM hubs. And these investments, as you just heard, can make a real difference in the lives of young people across the state. We heard from Derek Morales, we heard from Michelle Cantor, and those are just two examples of how applied learning can actually pull students through high school rather than trying to push them through by giving them hope and a tangible connection to a job, a good career, and a brighter future. And I believe those investments are going to help us increase high school completion, reduce dropout rates, increase the number of kids who are literate in math and science, and increase the number of kids who actually go on to get degrees and certificates in STEM and CTE. Stories like those, as you can see, impact very real people. And often in the budget process, this debate gets reduced to numbers on a piece of paper, and that certainly happened to me when I was in the legislature. So I want to close with just a very short story. When I was Senate President in 1986, we had a revenue shortfall in our Medicaid budget, so the overall budget was out of balance, and we were called in May to rebalance the budget. And we did a couple of things. We cut provider reimbursement rates a little, we put some money in from the E-Fund, and we changed income eligibility standards for the medically needy program and dropped 4,300 nameless, faceless people off of state health insurance coverage. And I was astounded at how easy it was. We were sitting in a hearing room, great spring day going on outside. We looked at a couple pieces of paper and some numbers, took some votes, and the budget was balanced. And then I went back to Roseburg and was practicing the ER 6 months later, and I started to see some of the people coming into the emergency room who'd actually lost coverage because of this sterile, sort of easy accounting exercise we went through in May. And one of them was a middle-aged man who'd suffered a massive stroke because he couldn't get his blood pressure medication. So I hope that as we debate the budget and the competing priorities and where we're going to put the money, we don't lose sight of the fact that these aren't just numbers on a piece of paper. These kids were not numbers on a piece of paper. Those numbers and our decisions reflect real people with names and faces and hopes and dreams and aspirations and lives of their own, the lives of our fellow Oregonians. So I hope if we can keep that in mind as we move through this budget process, we're going to do just fine. Thank you very much.